a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a conflict fought between the United States, the United Kingdom, and their respective allies. Historians in Britain often see it as a minor theatre of the Napoleonic Wars. In the United States and Canada, it is seen as a war in its own right. Since the outbreak of war with Napoleonic France, Britain had enforced a naval blockade to choke off neutral trade to France, which the United States contested as illegal under international law. To man the blockade, Britain impressed American merchant sailors into the Royal Navy. Incidents such as the Chesapeake Leopard affair inflamed anti-British sentiment. In 1811, the British were in turn outraged by the Little Belt affair, in which 11 British sailors died. The British supplied Indians who conducted raids on American settlers on the frontier, which hindered American expansion, and also provoked resentment. Historians remain divided on whether the desire to annex some or all of British North America contributed to the American decision to go to war. On June 18, 1812, United States President James Madison, after receiving heavy pressure from the war hawks in Congress, signed the American Declaration of War into law. With the majority of their army in Europe fighting Napoleon, the British adopted a defensive strategy. American prosecution of the war effort suffered from its unpopularity, especially in New England, where it was derogatorily referred to as Mr. Madison's War. American defeats at the Siege of Detroit and the Battle of Queenston Heights thwarted attempts to seize Upper Canada, improving British morale. American attempts to invade Lower Canada and capture Montreal also failed. In 1813, at the Battle of Lake Erie the Americans won control of Lake Erie, and at the Battle of the Thames defeated Tecumseh's Confederacy, securing a primary war goal. At sea, the powerful Royal Navy blockaded American ports, cutting off trade and allowing the British to raid the coast at will. In 1814, one of these raids burned the capital, Washington, although the Americans subsequently repulsed British attempts to invade New England and capture Baltimore. At home, the British faced mounting opposition to wartime taxation and demands to reopen trade with America. With the abdication of Napoleon, the blockade of France ended and the British ceased impressment, rendering the issue of the impressment of American sailors moot. The British were then able to increase the strength of the blockade on the United States coast, annihilating American maritime trade, and bringing the United States government near to bankruptcy. Peace negotiations began in August 1814, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24 as neither side wanted to continue fighting. News of the peace did not reach America. For some time, unaware that the treaty had been signed, British forces invaded Louisiana and were defeated at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815. These later victories were viewed by Americans as having restored national honor, leading to the collapse of anti-war sentiment and the beginning of the era of good feelings, a period of national unity. News of the treaty arrived shortly thereafter, halting military operations. The treaty was unanimously ratified by the United States on February 17, 1815, ending the war with status quo ante bellum. Origins. Historians have long debated the relative weight of the multiple reasons underlying the origins of the War of 1812. This section summarizes several contributing factors which resulted in the declaration of war by the United States. Honor and the Second War of Independence. As Richard notes, a powerful motivation for the Americans was the desire to uphold national honor in the face of what they considered to be British insults such as the Chesapeake Leopard affair. H. W. Brand says, the other war hawks spoke of the struggle with Britain as a second war of independence. Andrew Jackson, who still bore scars from the First War of Independence, held that view with special conviction. The approaching conflict was about violations of American rights, but it was also about vindication of American identity. Americans at the time and historians since have often called it the United States' Second War of Independence. The British were also offended by what they considered insults such as the Little Belt affair. This gave the British a particular interest in capturing the United States flagship president, which they succeeded in doing in 1815. Impressment and naval actions. In 1807, Britain introduced a series of trade restrictions via the Orders in Council to impede neutral trade with France, which Britain was then fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. The United States contested these restrictions as illegal under international law. Historian Reginald Horseman states, "A large section of influential British opinion, both in the government and in the country, thought that America presented a threat to British maritime supremacy. The American merchant marine had come close to doubling between 1802 and 1810, making it by far the largest neutral fleet. Britain was the largest trading partner, receiving 80% of U.S. cotton and 50% of other U.S. exports. The British public and press were resentful of the growing mercantile and commercial competition. The United States' view was that Britain's restrictions violated its right to trade with others. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Royal Navy expanded to 176 ships of the line and 600 ships overall, requiring 140,000 sailors to man. While the Royal Navy could man its ships with volunteers in peacetime, it competed in wartime with merchant shipping and privateers for a small pool of experienced sailors and turned to impressment from ashore and foreign or domestic shipping when it could not operate its ships with volunteers alone. The United States believed that British deserters had a right to become U.S. citizens. Britain did not recognize a right whereby a British subject could relinquish his status as a British subject, emigrate, and transfer his national allegiance as a naturalized citizen to any other country. This meant that in addition to recovering naval deserters, it considered any United States citizens who were born British liable for impressment. Aggravating the situation was the reluctance of the United States to issue formal naturalization papers and the widespread use of unofficial or forged identity or protection papers by sailors. This made it difficult for the Royal Navy to distinguish Americans from non-Americans and led it to impress some Americans who had never been British. Some gained freedom on appeal. Thus, while the United States recognized British-born sailors on American ships as Americans, Britain did not. It was estimated by the Admiralty that there were 11,000 naturalized sailors on United States ships in 1805. U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin stated that 9,000 U.S. sailors were born in Britain. Moreover, a great number of these British-born sailors were Irish. An investigation by Captain Isaac Chauncey in 1808 found that 58% of sailors based in New York City were either naturalized citizens or recent immigrants, the majority of these foreign-born sailors being from Britain. Moreover, 80 of the 134 British sailors were Irish. American anger at impressment grew when British frigates were stationed just outside U.S. harbors in view of U.S. shores and searched ships for contraband, and impressed men while within U.S. territorial waters. Well-publicized impressment actions such as the Leander Affair and the Chesapeake Leopard Affair outraged the American public. The British public in turn were outraged by the Little Belt Affair, in which a larger American ship clashed with a small British sloop, resulting in the deaths of 11 British sailors. Both sides claimed the other fired first, but the British public in particular blamed the US for attacking a smaller vessel, with calls for revenge by some newspapers, while the US was encouraged by the fact they had won a victory over the Royal Navy. The US Navy also forcibly recruited British sailors, but the British government saw impressment as commonly accepted practice and preferred to rescue British sailors from American impressment on a case-by-case basis. British support for Native American raids. The Northwest Territory, which consisted of the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, was the battleground for conflict between the Native American nations and the United States. The British Empire had ceded the area to the United States in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, both sides ignoring the fact that the land was already inhabited by various Native American nations. These included the Miami, Winnebago, Shawnee, Fox, Sauk, Kickapoo, Delaware, and Wyandot. Some warriors, who had left their nations of origin, followed Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet and the brother of Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa had a vision of purifying his society by expelling the children of the evil spirit, the American settlers. The Indians wanted to create their own state in the Northwest to end the American threat forever, as it became clear that the Americans wanted all of the land in the old Northwest for themselves. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh formed a confederation of numerous tribes to block American expansion. The British saw the Native American nations as valuable allies and a buffer to its Canadian colonies and provided arms. Attacks on American settlers in the Northwest further aggravated tensions between Britain and the United States. Raiding grew more common in 1810 and 1811. Westerners in Congress found the raids intolerable and wanted them permanently ended. British policy towards the Indians of the Northwest was torn between the desire to keep the Americans fighting in the Northwest and to preserve a region that provided rich profits for Canadian fur traders, versus the fear that too much support for the Indians would cause a war with the United States. Through Tecumseh's plans for an Indian state in the Northwest would benefit British North America by making it more defensible. At the same time, the defeats suffered by Tecumseh's Confederation had the British leery of going too far to support what was probably a losing cause. In the months running up to the war, British diplomats attempted to diffuse tensions on the frontier. The Confederation's raids, and its very existence, hindered American expansion into rich farmlands in the Northwest Territory. Pratt writes, however, according to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the land-hungry frontiersmen, with no doubt that their troubles with the Native Americans were the result of British intrigue, exacerbated the problem by stories after every Native American raid of British Army muskets and equipment being found on the field. Thus, the Westerners were convinced that their problems could best be solved by forcing the British out of Canada. The British had the long-standing goal of creating a large, neutral, Native American state to cover much of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. They made the demand as late as the fall of 1814 at the Peace Conference, but lost control of Western Ontario in 1813 at key battles on and around Lake Erie. These battles destroyed the Indian Confederacy, which had been the main ally of the British in that region, weakening its negotiating position. Although much of the area remained under British or British-allied Native Americans' control until the end of the war, the British, at American insistence and with higher priorities, dropped the demands. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like